For 90 years, the water never moved. It sat there, flat and silver and silent, reflecting the mountains like a mirror that had forgotten what it was hiding. Tourists photographed it. Fishermen drifted across it. Nobody alive remembered what was underneath. Then, in the spring, the engineers came to drain it. A routine inspection of the dam, they said. Lower the water, check the concrete, fill it back up. A few weeks of work, nothing more. They got 11 meters down before they stopped. Not because the equipment failed, not because the dam was unsafe. They stopped because of what started to rise out of the mud as the water pulled back. And once you understand what they saw, you'll understand why one of those engineers later said he hasn't slept properly since. Let me take you back to the beginning, because to understand what came out of that reservoir, you have to understand what went into it. A valley that was alive. Before the dam, this was a living valley. A river ran through the bottom of it, slow and brown, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above. Along its banks sat a village, not large, maybe 400 people. A stone church with a single bell, a schoolhouse, a graveyard on the hill where families had buried their dead for over 2 centuries. There were orchards. There were roads. There was a bridge, arched and old, that the children used to jump from in summer. And then, in the 1930s, the government decided the growing cities downstream needed water, and power. More than 400 villagers needed their homes. The decision was final. The people were given a date and a small amount of money, and they were told to leave. Most of them did. They dug up what they could carry. They took their furniture, their tools, their animals. Some of them, and this is the part that matters, went to the graveyard on the hill and tried to move their dead. But moving a grave is expensive and slow, and the deadline was coming. Records from the time suggest that of the several hundred graves in that cemetery, fewer than half were ever relocated. The rest were left exactly where they lay. Then they sealed the valley, blocked the river, and let the water climb. It took nearly 2 years to fill. The church tower was the last thing to disappear. Witnesses said the bell rang once on its own as the water reached it, when a gust of wind caught it before it went under. After that, silence. For 90 years. The drain begins. The dam was old now, and old dams have to be inspected. Engineers can scan concrete with instruments, but every few decades the only way to truly check the base of a dam is to lower the water and look at it with human eyes. So they opened the lower gates. The water dropped slowly at first, a few centimeters a day. The shoreline crept outward, exposing mud that hadn't seen sunlight in nearly a century. And as it did, the valley began to come back, not as a memory, as a thing you could walk into. First came the tops of the orchard trees, black and skeletal, perfectly preserved by the cold, oxygen-starved water at the bottom. Then the old road, the actual road, still leading somewhere. Then the bridge, that arched stone bridge the children used to jump from, emerging from the falling water completely intact, as if it had been waiting the whole time for someone to cross it again. If this is the kind of story that gets under your skin, the kind where a place keeps its secrets longer than anyone's been alive, do me a favor and hit subscribe. We go into the histories most people would rather stay buried. There's a lot more coming. Now, back to the valley, the town that refused to rot. By the time the water dropped past 15 meters, the engineers weren't inspecting a dam anymore. They were standing in a ghost town. The stone walls of houses still stood, doorways framed nothing but mud. The schoolhouse still had the iron frame of a bell mounted above the entrance. And the church was almost whole. Its tower rose out of the silt, streaked with sediment, but unmistakably a church, the same one that had vanished 90 years before. The cold and the lack of oxygen at the bottom of a deep reservoir do something strange. They stop the rot. Wood that should have dissolved decades ago was still wood. Iron that should have rusted to nothing was still recognizable. The valley hadn't decayed. It had been held in suspension, paused the way you pause a film. And then the engineers reached the hill, the graveyard, the part of the valley that nobody in the modern crew had been told about because the records were old and incomplete, and nobody had read the fine print about the cemetery that was never fully moved. What rose out of the mud? As the water pulled back from the hillside, the shapes emerged slowly. Rectangular outlines in the silt, stone markers, tilted but standing, and in places where the soft mud had washed away, openings, old graves, their contents disturbed by 90 years of slow currents and shifting sediment. The crew stopped. This was no longer an engineering job. This was a cemetery, exposed in a state nobody had anticipated. There were remains down there, the people whose families, all those decades ago, had run out of time and money and been forced to leave them behind. The dead who were promised they'd be moved and never were. One of the engineers, a man who'd spent 30 years inspecting dams across the country, was the one who called it. He told his supervisor they were stopping, not lowering the water another centimeter. He said something that stuck with the rest of the crew, that they had come to inspect concrete, and instead they had walked into someone's family and it wasn't theirs to disturb. The work halted, authorities were called, and the questions began. Questions that 90 years later nobody had a clean answer to. The reckoning nobody wanted. Here's the thing about draining a reservoir like this. You can't just leave it drained. The towns downstream depend on the water and the power, so the choice in front of everyone was impossible. Refill the reservoir, and you bury the graveyard again, along with whatever dignity might be owed to the people in it. Leave it drained long enough to properly relocate the remains, and you cut off water to thousands of people who had nothing to do with a decision made in the 1930s. There was also the harder question, the one nobody wanted to say out loud. These weren't anonymous bones. Somewhere there were descendants, grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the families who'd been forced out, who had no idea their ancestors were still down there, still waiting, never moved at all. The paperwork from the 1930s had quietly recorded the graves as relocated, because that was easier than admitting the truth, that the deadline had won and the dead had been left behind. In the end, the decision was made the way these decisions almost always are. The remains that were exposed were carefully recovered and reburied on higher ground, with a proper ceremony this time. The records were corrected, and then the gates were closed, and the water began to climb again, over the orchard, over the road, over the bridge, until the church tower was the last thing showing, and then it too slipped under. The reservoir looks exactly as it did before, flat, silver, silent. Tourists still photograph it, fishermen still drift across it, and almost none of them know that beneath that mirror, calm surface sits a whole valley, perfectly preserved in the cold and the dark, a church, a bridge, a road that leads somewhere, and a hill full of people who were promised they'd be taken home and never were. The water keeps the secret now. It's good at that. It's had 90 years of practice. So here's what I want to know from you. If you were the engineer standing on that hillside, would you have kept draining to do right by the dead, even knowing it would cut the water to thousands of living people downstream? Or would you have sealed it back up and let the valley keep its silence? Drop your answer in the comments. I read everyone. And if this one stayed with you, wait until you see what surfaced when another reservoir dropped to its lowest level in a century. That video's next. Watch it before the water rises again.